One of the interesting things, if we were to zoom in with a camera on an insect or an arachnid, is that we see, for instance, with this bee here, that it looks like it's covered with a fur. Some other examples are this fly, this wasp, and a spider. In this video, we'll take a look at a fairly quick and easy way that we can create this effect in Maya. Now, I don't have a model to work with for this demonstration, so I'm going to go to Windows, General Editor's Content Browser, and we'll just pick one from the content browser. And since we are looking at insects, I'll go ahead and go with this wasp model here. Now, there are actually a number of different ways in Maya that we could accomplish this, that we could create some fur or hair that we could apply to this wasp here. But I'm going to be showing you a method that I think is one of the easier methods, one of the easier, quicker methods that will also be quite effective for what we want to do here. The technique that we'll be looking at in this video is using Maya's paint effects. And we can access the paint effects by, first of all, making sure that we're in our modeling menu set, and then going to Generate, Paint Effects tool. And if I click on that, what I can do is start painting a paint effect in my scene. Now, this is the most basic and simple paint effect. You can see that it looks like a tube. It looks like a piece of geometry similar to our polygon mesh here. But you'll notice that if I right-click on it, I actually do not get the same options that I do as on this wasp mesh here, where I can select vertices, faces, edges, and so on. The reason being that paint effects is something different. Paint effects are not actually polygon objects like this wasp mesh is. Now, this is the most basic paint effect brush, but we actually have a number of other brushes that we can choose from. And to take a look at those, we'll go once again to Generate, but this time, instead of selecting the paint effect tool itself, we'll go to Get Brush. And it'll open up the content browser once again, where you'll see that there's this category here of paint effects with a number of subfolders. Each one of these subfolders having different paint effects in it. It really is fun to try out some of these other brushes. For instance, there is this animal brush, and we can pick, for instance, this snake brown brush, and we can paint it in our environment. Notice that it looks very similar to the default brush here, but one thing that is important to understand with some of these paint effects is to see what they actually look like. You actually need to create a render of it. So I'm going to do that really quickly. I'm going to change my render to Maya software and just render out an image here, and you'll see that in fact this brush does look very much like a snake skin. Let's go ahead and try out some other brushes. Once again, going to Generate, Get Brush, and you'll see that there's a lot of options to choose from. For instance, we have this town brush here, or this quick street brush. If I select that one and paint in my environment here, you notice that we very quickly get what looks kind of like a cityscape. And again, if I render it out, you'll notice that to see what it actually looks like, we really do need to create a render. Once again, going to generate, get brush. You'll see that there's fire, electrical brushes, clouds, galactic. There's a lot of different categories to select from. One of the really useful ones is trees, and we can in fact paint trees in environments, for example. But the brushes that we want to look at are going to be found here under hair. A number of different options, once again, to select from. Let's try this Mohawk Deep Red. And you can see what that looks like. And that starts to look a little bit more like what we want to accomplish by creating fur or hair on this wasp mesh here. Now, the thing to keep in consideration right now is that all these brushes that we've used so far, we've been painting on basically this ground plane. If I just come over here with this paint effect and I try brushing it onto this wasp mesh, you'll notice that it is still just painting on the ground plane here. We need to make this polygon mesh paintable before we can actually start painting one of these effects on it. So how do we go about that? Well, let's take a look at an example. I'm going to create a sphere. Move it over here to the side. And what I'm going to do is return to Generate. And I'm going to select Make Paintable. And that'll make the mesh that I currently have selected paintable. It'll make it into a surface that we can actually paint these paint effects onto. So if we give that a try, you'll see that we can now paint this effect directly on the surface itself. These other brushes would work as well. I'll go to Generate, Get Brush, perhaps return back to those city meshes, or town brush. And you can see that I can also paint on it as well. A little bit of a problem here with the size of the brush, but if I want to change the size of the brush, I can hold down the B key, left mouse button, and make the brush smaller. And we can paint this townscape onto the sphere. Now, each one of these strokes, including this one that didn't quite lay on the surface well, I can actually come into its attributes and change some properties on it that would make it work better on that surface. And we'll be taking a look at some of these properties of these paint effects strokes in a little bit so that you'll be able to customize them more to get the effect that you're looking for. Now, one thing I should also point out is that one of the reasons why these paint effects work on these surfaces is because they do have UVs laid out. So in the case of this sphere, If we go to the UV editor, you'll see that it has the default UVs of a polygon sphere. And if we select this wasp mesh here, you can see that it has also been UV unwrapped. This is important for being able to paint these paint effects on these surfaces. It's important that they have the geometry has its own unique UV space laid out in a way such as this wasp mesh has been laid out here. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can apply these paint effects to this wasp mesh to create something like fur, like what we saw on those images at the beginning of this video. I'm going to go ahead and delete most of what I have in this scene here, and we'll focus on the wasp mesh here. So again, remember that this wasp mesh has had UVs laid out, and that's going to be important because similarly to textures, we need to have everything have its own unique 2D space so that we can paint these effects onto our mesh. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is make this mesh paintable, just like we did with that sphere previously. So I'll go back to Generate and say Make Paintable. Now the mesh is paintable and we can paint any of those strokes that we want onto it. You can see that right now I have this building or townscape brush and it works just fine on it. That's not the one we want though. We'll go ahead and pick a different brush. So I'll go to Generate, Get Brush, and we'll return to the hair folder and pick some hair that we think would be most appropriate for as a starting point for this mesh. Now the Mohawk Deep Red looked pretty good. It looks like there's this Punk Mohawk one also. That one could work quite well. But I think I'm going to go with this one here, the Hair Blonde Straight, because I think that most of those examples that we looked at of the photographs, that the hair looked somewhat similar to this example here. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on it so that that'll become my active brush. And we can go ahead and try painting onto our mesh here. Remember that if you want to see what it actually is going to look like, sometimes what you see in your working viewport here is a pretty good representation, but it always is recommended to go ahead and create a quick render to just take a look at the effect itself. So right now I think that the hair is too long, maybe too dense, and also it's blonde, and maybe that's not what we want for this example here. In fact, if we go back to those examples that we were looking at earlier, and we have this one of a wasp, you can see what its hairs look like, and maybe we'll try to do something a little bit more like that. Although, actually, looking at this, it does look like some of the hairs down here below the head and body here are kind of blondish. So maybe that's not such a bad choice after all. But I think I'm going to go with something a little bit more like these top hairs here that look a little bit more black. So as I had mentioned before, the parameters for these paint effects, you can actually access them by selecting the paint effect itself and coming over here to our attribute editor. Remember that typically your attribute editor will be found here on the right side of your user interface. where you have your channel box, modeling toolkit, and attribute editor. If you ever find that your attribute editor is not there, all you need to do is type Control A, and that will open up the attribute editor. Now my attribute editor window is floating. However, I can redock that if I wish, like that. So the interface in Maya, of course, is very customizable. Now, sometimes the attribute editor can be a little bit confusing because there can be a number of different tabs here when we have something selected, and sometimes you need to find the proper tab where the properties that you're looking for are located. And with this one, it's going to be this hair blonde straight. And you'll notice that there are a number of different properties here. The ones that we're going to be really looking at are this global scale. We'll look at a number of other properties under the tubes here, as well as some properties here with the shading and texturing. Under those properties, we'll be able to fine-tune this hair to get the effect that we're looking for. So the first property that we'll take a look at is a quick and easy way to change the size of the hair. And that is this property here, the global scale property. And what this does, because scale is obviously a very important issue in 3D. The fact that this is a wasp gives us a certain cue as to the size of it, but the size is really relative to whatever else is in our scene. So oftentimes we need to establish a scale in our 3D scenes, especially if you're working on a group project. We need to make sure that everybody is working at the same scale. Now, if I adjust that property, the global scale, and I increase it, you'll see that these hair follicles will become larger. And if I decrease it, they'll become smaller. So this could be a very quick and easy way to scale an effect. However, I'm going to go ahead and set the global scale back to 1 because we're going to take a look at a couple other properties that will give me a little bit more versatility, a little bit more power to really adjust this fur or hair like I want it. I think the first property we'll look at is the shading and texturing on it. So let's go ahead and do another render. We'll take a look and see what it currently looks like. Here's what it looks like. Again, it was a preset that was defined as blonde straight hair. And maybe I'll go ahead and keep this image so that we can compare it to other images. And what I'm going to do is come over here to shading and texturing. And if I click on the drop down for the shading, you'll notice that we have this first color, color 1. That's what's giving it its blonde color. We also have the color 2 under tube shading as well. That's also giving it its blonde color that we have here. So the way to think about this is that this color 1 is what you're getting at the base, and this color 2 is a gradient going towards the top. In fact, to take a look at that and understand it a little bit better, let's go ahead and make the base red, and we'll make the tip, we can make it yellow. You'll see what it's doing here. This gives us a pretty good visual here in our working view, but remember that it always is worthwhile to create a render just to make sure that it looks like you think it's going to look. So here it is with that red and yellow gradient. Now, that's not what we want. We'll go ahead and keep that image so that we can compare it to the original, which was like this. This is what we changed it to. Let's go ahead and select that stroke again, and we'll make it something very dark at its base. And then we'll desaturate it at its tip and also make it dark, but maybe not quite as dark as its base. Perhaps something like that. And we can render that out, see how that looks. Actually, I think I'll make the base a little bit darker. Okay, let's give that a try. And there it is. And I think I like that a little bit more. I think that's looking a little bit more like that image that we looked at earlier of a wasp. Now, while I won't get into detail with this in this video, do notice that under the tube shading, and that's what these are called, these are tubes that are coming off of that paint effect stroke that we created. We have our color, but we also have a hue random, saturation random, and value random. So this is actually adding a little bit of randomization in those colors. If we didn't want that randomization, we'd simply drag these sliders to 0 so that we would get no randomization whatsoever. I think I'll go ahead and keep the randomization. I think it can work for what I'm going for with this example. So we've finished with the shading, at least for the time being. I'm going to go ahead and collapse that, and we'll move on to the next section. So remember that I referred to these as tubes. These tubes come off of the stroke that I created along the body of this wasp. So to change the properties of these tubes, I'm going to go to this tubes drop-down, and we'll expand creation, and we can take a look at some of its properties. Now, we won't go into great detail on all of these different properties, and as you can see, there's actually quite a few, but we will talk about some of them. This first property under creation, the tubes per step, is set to 10, and that refers to how many of these tubes are going to be along this stroke here. And you can see that if I scrub that to the left, I get fewer and fewer strokes. The tube rand has to do with the randomization of how they are distributed along that stroke. So if I increase that, they become even more random. If I decrease that, they become more evenly spaced. The start tube simply refers to the beginning of the stroke and whether I have a bunch of tubes at the very beginning of the stroke or not. Generally, you won't want to have a number of strokes there, but there might be some instances where you do. These next two properties, actually, before I jump to those other properties, let me just talk about segments. Set to 14 right now. That refers to the number of segments along the length of the tube. If we wanted to create a curl or wrinkle in these, we would need to have more sections in it, in the same way that you would need to have more sections on a polygon mesh if you wanted to bend it. For the time being, we'll go ahead and leave that at 14. I don't think I'm going to be adding any wrinkles or curls into these, but I will be showing you how you can do that a little bit later. These two properties are very important, the length min and max. They refer to the length of these tubes. So this is another way that we can decrease the size of this hair, or increase it for that matter. And what we're getting is some randomization happening here, because we have both a length min and a max. If we take that minimum down, you'll see that we get more variation, where we get some little stubby follicles, and then we get some longer ones. If we increase that so that it's approximately the same length as the max, then they are all pretty much uniform in length. So if you want some variation in the length of these hairs, you can make the length min and max different numbers. to add a little bit of variation in them. Now, with the length max, that is the maximum length of these, and I think we determined that maybe this is a little bit too long, so I'm going to bring that down. We're getting a weird bend in it right now, but that's because the length minimum is greater than the length max. So we'll go ahead and bring that down as well. Perhaps something like that. I think that could be a good length for this. I think I will increase the density on these. Perhaps something a little more like that. I don't really need to adjust the width 1 and 2 here, but it will be important for you to understand what that's referring to. That refers to, in the case of the tube width 1, the base. If we increase it, they'll become thicker. Decrease it, they become thinner. And we can do that both for the base as well as the tip. I'm going to keep them very fine. Perhaps something like that. Once again, you'll see there is some randomization that we can add to that width. In this case, I don't think that's really necessary, so I'm not going to adjust that. The other thing I'd like to point out is this checkbox here, the surface snap. You will notice, if you look very closely, that the stroke, that it actually doesn't paint along just the stroke, but to the left and right of it. And when it does that, we're actually getting some of these hair follicles floating above the surface. That's an easy fix because I'm simply going to check surface snap. So I pretty much have this, I think, like I want it. Now I would be ready maybe to paint more hair on this mesh here. But before we do that, we'll go ahead and take a look at a couple other properties. Again, I don't want to get too much in depth with these because that would make for quite a lengthy video. But you'll see that we have some width scale properties that further give us capabilities beyond just what we looked at here with the tube width 1 and 2. Some of these properties have to do also with the way that the fur or hair lays on the surface, whether you want it upright or off to the side, for example. I'm going to keep these sticking more or less straight up. Growth is a very interesting one, and not one that we really need to look at for this example, but this is where you can see that you would be able to take something like these tubes and make them into things like trees, and even add twigs and leaves and flowers and so on. But we're not going to do that now, but that's a way that you could actually create trees if you wanted for landscapes and that kind of thing. I'm going to uncheck branches because we want to keep this fur. And I think the next thing we'll look at will be here under behavior. Again, I don't really need to adjust the behavior of these, but I'd like you to be familiar with what you can do with them. So I'll go to displacement, and you'll notice that we have a number of different properties such as noise, wiggle, curl, along with the frequency for these properties. And that's where the sections in here become important. And if you remember, they were set to 14. So that should give us enough if we wanted to add some noise to it, that we could make them a little bit more, let's say, crinkly, like that. We could even adjust the noise frequency, which would be more apparent if we had more segments in this. We can add wiggle, increase the wiggle frequency, curl, Anyway, using these properties, you can really kind of fine-tune the way that the hair looks, so that instead of it being really straight, like what we're going to keep it, we could make it look more curly or wrinkly or whatever. So now that we've defined the hair for this, perhaps we should do a render just to make sure that it is giving us the effect we want. I think it's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll bring down that noise actually. And the curl, so they're more straight like that, kind of like what we saw in the image. And we can go ahead and start painting more of these because we've defined the way that we want the brush to work. Now, it's not as simple as just selecting our paint tool, either by going to Generate Paint Effects Tool, or because it's actually the last tool that I've used, it's still available here as well. This icon indicates the last tool used. You'll notice that if I actually start painting in here, it's still painting the original stroke there, which is not what we want. What we need to do is tell the Paint Effects brush to use these settings used on this stroke here. So here's how we can go about that. I select the stroke itself. I return to Generate, and I'm going to click on Get Settings from Selected Stroke. So now when I use that paint effect brush, it'll paint it using these very same settings. And now we can go ahead and paint more of these hairs on our wasp here. And if we render it out, it will look like this. Now remember that while they look like geometry, and in a sense they are geometry, they're just not polygon geometry. Remember that it's actually something different than polygon meshes. In fact, if we were to come over here in our viewport to show and hide polygons, hide all our polygons in our scene, you'll notice that it'll hide the mesh, but we can still see the hair that we have painted onto our insect here. A couple of other things I'd like to talk a little bit about are rendering, and a couple of issues that you might run into and ways that you can work with that and make it look better. So I've put a light in my scene and I've made it cast shadows. Let's go ahead and create a render of this and take a look at what it looks like right now. here's what we've got. You can see the hairs that we've applied to this mesh. What I'd like to point out to you is that currently these hairs are accepting light, but they are actually not casting shadows. And perhaps with this example, that's what I want. I probably don't actually want these hair follicles here to cast shadows, but you want to be able to have the ability to make them cast shadows if necessary. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. I'll zoom in here so that we can get a better look. Perhaps create another render. You can see that they are in fact not casting shadows. But what we can do is select the effect. Maybe I'll select this one here. And go to its properties in the attribute editor. We've done most of the work on modifying these by going to tubes here. But what we actually want to look at when it comes to lighting is illumination and shadow effects. So illumination, right now they are currently being illuminated. And we can see that because the illuminated checkbox is checked. But if we go to shadow effects, you'll see that the fake shadow property is set to none. Now, if we go to this drop down and we set it to 3D cast, then they will in fact cast shadows. And we don't see it in here, but we can just click on this checkbox here, cast shadows, and you can barely see it. You can see it's a little bit of a shadow on the top of the head there. Let's go ahead and render it out and see what it looks like. And you can see that the shadows don't look great, but they are in fact casting shadows. With this particular example, I probably wouldn't have it cast shadows. I think that cast shadows will work much more effectively with things like paint effect trees, or perhaps those the townscape brush that we looked at, that kind of thing. But there is the capability of making them cast shadows, and there are a number of different properties here to fine-tune to make the shadows look a little bit better. For this particular example, I'm going to go ahead and switch it back to none, because I think that actually having each one of these individual hairs cast a shadow for this particular example is overkill, and will in fact detract. It'll make it look less good, in my opinion. Now, another thing I'd like to show you with this before we wrap this up is how we can actually take these paint effects and convert them into polygon meshes. Remember that currently these paint effects are something different. They are not polygon objects, okay? But as I said, we can convert them into polygon objects, and here is how we can do that. Now, I'm going to select all of my strokes here in my outliner so that they're all selected, because I want to convert them all to polygon objects. And what I'm going to do is go to Modify, Convert, Paint Effects to Polygons. I'm going to open up the options for it because there is one option I would like to show you, and that is this one here, the quad output. I have it checked. I actually prefer to have the output be quads rather than triangles. All I need to do now is apply. And it has converted all of these hair follicles now to polygon meshes. So they're still individual polygon meshes. You can see that here's one set of hair, here's another set of hair. But what we can now do, if we needed to, is right click on it, and you can see now that you have all those options that you have with any polygon mesh of selecting the vertices, the faces, the edges, and doing any of the kind of 3D modeling effects that you might choose to do. One other thing I should mention is that now that we've converted these to polygon meshes, it makes it a little bit easier to work with if we wanted to do other things with the textures, for example. We can take a look at that in just a moment, but then the other thing I wanted to point out to you is that they are in fact now casting shadows, even though we turned them off for the original paint effect. They are casting some shadows. It gets a little confusing just because of the resolution of our shadows and because of all the fine hairs that we have here. But they are casting shadows. They are being affected by the light. A couple things I might do. Why would you convert these to polygon meshes? Well, there are cases where it'll either render better or it might make it easier for you to work with, in which case you may choose to convert them to polygon meshes. A couple things I might do to make it a little bit easier to work with them if I did, well, I have converted them to polygon meshes, so one thing I might do is select all of my polygon meshes that are the hair here. There are a number of them, and I'll come over here to my modeling toolkit and I'll combine them so that it'll become one single polygon mesh. I'll come over here to my channel box, rename it so that it has a more logical name. Call it Wasp Fur. Delete history on it. And now that I've done that, I can actually get rid of a lot of this junk in here. I don't need that anymore, these paint effect strokes. Get rid of those. Clean up my scene a little bit, and now we've got this separate mesh that is the fur or hair on our wasp. Another thing perhaps I should point out to you is that when we converted these paint effects to a polygon object, it actually created a number of materials. In fact, you can see that we've got a bunch of materials that are more or less the very same material. In fact, they are the same material, just multiple versions of it applied to this hair here. And perhaps what we could do to simplify that a little bit would be to create our own material. What I'm going to do is create a gradient for it, I think. Or maybe I'll just give it a color first. We'll just give it a color. I'm going to select the fur, apply that color to it, take a look at it. You can see that now it's just this red solid color here. But what we can do then is come in here and tell it to get rid of unused nodes. So I'm going to go here to Edit, Delete Unused Nodes. It'll get rid of all that junk so that we only have this one material for all the hair. Perhaps name it. And I think I'll do something a little different, a little similar, more similar to what we had there before. What I'm going to do is apply a gradient to it. And we'll just give it another color there, a little more similar to what we had before. So the benefit of this, of course, is that we are, instead of having, I don't know, 20 or 30 different materials in here, we now have this one material being applied to all of the fur in our scene. So as I'd mentioned earlier in the video, at the very beginning, that there are actually a number of different ways that we could create this effect of fur or hair on our meshes. N-hair is another example. The advantage to N-hair is that it would actually react to movement and to other forces such as wind and things like that in your environment. But this is a quick and easy solution, and I think that'll pretty much do it for this video. So I hope that the video is helpful for you, and thank you for watching.